I've been thinking a lot about the violence of geometry this morning.
The violence of geometry, that's quite an opening to start our deep dive today.
Yeah, I know it sounds a bit intense, but I was just staring at this massive world map I have on my office wall. And you look at those clean black lines separating the countries, right?
Right.
France stops here, Germany starts there,
Yeah.
the US is on this side, Mexico is on that side. It all looks so orderly.
It does. It creates this sense of stability, like the world is just a finished product.
Exactly. It looks permanent. Like those lines were etched into the Earth's crust the day the planet was formed. But then I started digging into the source material for today, and I realized those lines are actually more like scar tissue.
That is a fascinating way to put it.
They aren't static at all. They are these living, breathing, totally friction-filled things. And honestly, they are dangerous.
They really are. We tend to think of borders as fixed facts, but they are absolutely living things. And you're right, they're almost always born out of friction. What we're really looking at today is the invisible architecture of global power.
Oh, I love that phrase. Invisible architecture.
It fits perfectly because our source material today is a deep dive into AP Human Geography topic 4.5, the anatomy and authority of political boundaries.
Which sounds super academic.
It does sound like a dry textbook topic, I know. But it's actually this incredible crash course in why the world is organized the way it is, and more importantly, why it so often falls apart.
Right. So our mission today for you listening is to look past the ink on the map. We're going to figure out how a border is actually built, and spoiler alert, it is a four-step process. Way more complicated than just drawing a line.
Much more complicated.
We are also going to look at why neighbors literally kill each other over these lines, and then what happens when we try to draw those boundaries on the ocean.
And grounding all of this, we really have to talk about sovereignty. Because at the end of the day, that is what every single border is about. It's about where one group's authority ends and another group's begins.
So let's just unpack this. I want to start with the actual birth of a border.
Hmm.
Because before reading this, I honestly assumed borders were just, natural boundaries.
Like a river or a mountain.
Exactly. I thought people just walked until they hit a river and said, well, this is it. But it turns out creating a recognized international border is a very specific, rigorous life cycle.
It is a massive legal and physical undertaking. You don't just wake up with a border. The source breaks this down into 4 distinct phases. And the first one is what we call the defined phase.
And this is entirely legal, right? Not physical at all.
Completely legal. This is the treaty phase. Countries have to explicitly state the boundary location in legal documentation. They sit down, they write it out, and the language has to be incredibly precise.
Give me an example of that.
Well, they might write something like, the border follows the median line of this specific river, or it runs from the exact peak of this mountain to the peak of that mountain.
Or if they're in a rush, or maybe there just aren't any mountains around, they just use math.
Yes, latitude and longitude.
Geometric lines.
Exactly. So phase 1 is the definition. It is just words on a page. But phase 2 is where the artists come in. This is the delimited phase.
I call this the cartographer's phase.
That's exactly what it is.
Right.
Delimitation is the act of taking that very dense legal description from the treaty and translating it onto an official map.
Which honestly sounds easier than it is.
Oh, it is incredibly difficult. Because remember, the world is a 3-dimensional sphere. It is full of bumps and valleys and weird curves. But a map is a flat piece of paper.
Right.
So translating a phrase like the ridge of the mountain onto a flat map can actually lead to massive disagreements later on if that map isn't absolutely perfect.
Okay, so we have a treaty, which is the words. We have a map, which is the drawing. But we still don't have anything actually stopping me from just walking across the line.
No, you just have paper at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
And that brings us to phase 3, which is my favorite part. This is where the reality sets in. The demarcated phase.
Yes, demarcation. The physical marking. This is the moment the line becomes real on the landscape. It goes from being a concept to being a physical object.
Now, historically, this meant what? Pillars. Piles of stones.
Historically, yes. You would see literal stone markers or maybe a simple fence or concrete pillars spaced out every few miles.
But today it's a bit different.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Today, demarcation has evolved into this massive high-tech surveillance architecture.
We aren't just talking about a chain link fence anymore.
Not at all. We are talking about seismic sensors buried deep in the ground that can detect the vibration of footsteps. We're talking about infrared cameras, drone corridors, biometric scanning. The line has evolved from a stone marker in a field to a fully integrated digital surveillance zone. It is a massive infrastructure project now.
That makes a lot of sense. It's no longer just, here is the line. It's, we are actively watching the line, which perfectly leads into the fourth phase, which I guess never really ends, the administered phase.
Precisely. This is the management part, the ongoing daily grind of the border. Because a boundary isn't just a wall, it is a filter.
Right. You have people, goods, money, even information trying to cross it every single second of the day.
And administration is how a government decides to handle that flow. It's the passports, the visas, the customs duties, the immigration laws.
It's the bureaucracy of the boundary.
Exactly. And if that administration phase fails, everything just grinds to a halt, trade stops, people get stuck in limbo.
Okay, so if you want to see this entire four-step life cycle in action, the source uses the U.S.-Canada border as the ultimate prototype, specifically the western half.
The 49th parallel, it really is the textbook example. It started out as a treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain. That is the defined phase.
Right.
Then the cartographers drew that long, perfectly straight line all the way across the map, the delimited phase.
And then, over decades, they literally went out into the wilderness and cut a 20-foot-wide clearing straight through the forest.
Yes, the slash. They cleared the trees and placed physical markers. That is the demarcated phase.
Which is just wild to think about, a physical slash through thousands of miles of wilderness.
And today, of course, it is heavily administered. You have checkpoints, border patrol, customs. It followed the four-step script perfectly.
But here's where the neat and tidy theory runs headfirst into reality.
Yeah.
You can have the treaty, you can have the perfect map, you can build the pillars and the checkpoints, and people will still go to war over that line.
Because the world is messy. Even with all those careful steps, things go wrong. Humans are involved.
So let's pivot and look at why we fight. The source material breaks this down into 4 specific types of boundary disputes. And what I found so interesting here is that we aren't classifying these by who is fighting. We're classifying them by why they are fighting.
Right, the root cause of the friction. And usually these stem from culture, history, or economics. The first type we need to look at is a definitional dispute.
So this goes all the way back to phase 1, the treaty phase.
Exactly. A definitional dispute happens when two countries completely disagree over the interpretation of the legal language itself. They are basically arguing over the fine print.
The classic example from the reading is Argentina and Chile, right?
Yes. They share a massive border along the Andes Mountains, and they have a treaty from the 19th century that was supposed to settle everything.
But it didn't.
No, because the treaty used phrasing about the highest peaks and the watershed lines.
Which sounds totally reasonable on paper until you realize that water doesn't always flow the way you think it does in a mountain range.
Exactly. In the southern tip of the Andes, the physical geography gets incredibly complex. So both nations looked at the exact same treaty, they read the exact same words, but they interpreted those words differently to claim ownership of these strategic islands at the bottom of the continent.
It's essentially a giant legal argument. It's like 2 family members reading a will and aggressively arguing over what the back property actually means.
That is a very fair analogy. It's a dispute over the definition.
Yeah.
But then you move to the second type, which is where things get a bit more chaotic. Locational disputes.
Oh, this one is fascinating. This is the nature versus ink problem.
Yes. This happens when the border actually physically moves, or the interpretation of where it sits on the actual ground changes.
And the example that really helped me grasp this was the Rio Grande.
It is the absolute classic case of a locational dispute. The Rio Grande defines a huge portion of the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and the original treaty basically said the center of the river is the boundary line. Simple, right?
Totally simple. Until it rains.
Until nature does what nature does, rivers snake around, they erode their banks, they change course. Now, international law actually has a very specific mechanism for dealing with this. They distinguish between 2 things, accretion and avulsion.
Okay, break that down for us. Accretion versus avulsion.
Accretion is slow, gradual movement. Think of soil slowly washing away from one riverbank and gradually piling up on the other side over years and years.
Okay, so if that happens, does the border move?
Yes. Under accretion, the border slowly moves right along with the river. It's flexible.
Got it. But what about avulsion?
Avulsion is violent and sudden. This is when a river completely jumps its banks, usually during a massive hurricane or a flood, and it carves a totally new channel overnight.
So you wake up and the river is suddenly a mile to the left.
Exactly. And under international law, if avulsion happens, the border stays exactly where the old river used to be. The line doesn't move just because the water did.
Wait, so you could have a piece of land that is suddenly physically on the Mexican side of the water, but legally it still belongs to the U.S. because the river moved too fast.
That is exactly what happened. It was called the Chamizal dispute. You had this tract of land that got entirely cut off by the shifting river. So a rancher could go to sleep in Mexico, a flood happens, and they wake up on the north side of the river, physically connected to Texas, but technically their land is still sovereign Mexican territory, or vice versa.
That sounds like a diplomatic nightmare.
It was. It took nearly a century to resolve, all because we tried to force a permanent geometric concept onto a moving natural feature.
It just shows the absurdity of trying to control nature with ink. So we have fighting over words, which is definitional. We have fighting over shifting land, which is locational. The third type from the source is operational disputes.
Right, and this one is different because everyone agrees on where the line is. Nobody's arguing about the map or the treaty.
No, it's fighting over how the border functions.
Exactly. It is a disagreement over the management style. The source looks at the U.S. and Mexico again for this one, specifically regarding undocumented immigrants.
Right, and we should be clear here. The source notes that both countries acknowledge they have a shared responsibility for the border. Both sides know exactly where the border is.
Yes, the friction isn't about the location. The conflict arises over the enforcement methods and who bears the costs. It's a disagreement on the mechanics of the filter.
One side might prioritize a specific type of enforcement, while the other side favors a different approach. The dispute is purely operational.
Precisely. And then we get to the fourth type, which honestly is often the most dangerous, allocational disputes.
Oh, I call this the I drink your milkshake dispute.
The movie reference fits perfectly here. Allocational disputes are all about resources.
It's about money and value.
Yes. This happens when a highly valuable resource, like a massive underground oil field or a vital water aquifer, sits right under the boundary line or crosses it.
And the immediate question is, who gets to pump it out?
Exactly. Because underground resources are fluids. Oil, natural gas, water. If you set up a drill on your side of the border, you can actually drain the resource from underneath your neighbor's sovereign land.
The example in the text that really struck me was Iraq and Kuwait in the 1990s.
The Rumaila oil field, it's a massive reservoir of energy that lies deep beneath both countries. And Iraq officially accused Kuwait of slant drilling.
Which is exactly what it sounds like, right?
Yes. The accusation was that Kuwait was drilling down on their own side of the border, but they were angling the drill bit sideways deep underground to cross the subterranean boundary and suck oil directly out of Iraqi territory.
That is incredibly bold.
It is essentially the theft of sovereignty. And it wasn't just a minor diplomatic complaint. The source highlights that this specific allocational dispute was a primary trigger for the invasion of Kuwait.
It literally started a war.
It did. It proves that these lines aren't just symbolic concepts. If you drill under them, people go to war.
And that actually leads us to a much darker side of how these boundaries are drawn in the first place. Because we talked about the orderly four-step process with the U.S. and Canada, but historically, a lot of boundaries were not drawn by the people actually living there. They were drawn purely for power.
Yes, we are talking about policy-based boundaries, or superimposed boundaries. This is the lasting legacy of colonialism.
The source brings up the DMZ in Korea really briefly, right? A 2-mile-wide buffer zone established by treaty where military forces face off, but operations inside the zone are forbidden.
Right. That is a boundary strictly enforced for military and political strategy. But the ultimate historical example of lines drawn for power is the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885.
The scramble for Africa.
Exactly. If you want to talk about the violence of geometry, picture this scene. It's 1884. You have the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and they are all gathered in a grand conference room in Berlin.
And they just have a massive map of Africa pinned to the wall.
A huge map. And they have rulers and pencils. And they proceed to just carve up an entire continent. They drew straight geometric lines across the map to distribute the territory among themselves for political and economic gain.
But the detail that always gets me is who was in the room. Or rather, who wasn't.
Right. Not a single African leader was invited. Not one.
They were dividing up a continent of millions of people without asking a single one of them.
It was an act of pure imperial arrogance. They drew these rigid lines that cut right through existing centuries-old tribal kingdoms.
They took groups that had been historical enemies and suddenly forced them to live inside the exact same colony.
And conversely, they took unified ethnic and cultural groups and split them down the middle, putting half in one European jurisdiction and half in another. They completely ignored the human geography on the ground.
All to prioritize their own resource extraction.
Completely. And the reason this matters so much for our deep dive today is that we are still paying the price for those exact lines. When you look at the significant border disputes, the civil wars, and the instability in parts of Africa today, so much of that is a direct result of those ghost lines drawn by men in a room in Berlin 140 years ago.
It's sobering to think about. We look at a map of Africa today and we just see countries, but what we are really seeing is the scar tissue from 1885.
Well put. It is a legacy of superimposed boundaries that doesn't just fade away because time passes.
Okay, I want to shift gears here. We have been talking entirely about land, mountains, rivers, stone pillars, forests, but the research asks a really fascinating question. What happens when the land runs out?
Right, because eventually every line hits the ocean. And for a very long time in human history, the ocean was just free space, the freedom of the seas.
You can't have free space when there are billions of dollars of oil to be found out there.
Exactly. So the international community tried to take this land-based logic of boundaries and push it out into the water. And this framework is governed by UNCLOS.
The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
That's the one. It is the framework that extends sovereignty into the ocean.
And it creates these invisible zones in the water, which is where things get really wild because the rules literally change depending on how many miles out you swim.
They do. It's a tiered system. The first zone is the territorial sea. This goes up to 12 nautical miles out from the coast.
And that is basically sovereign soil.
Right.
Just wet.
Yes, for all intents and purposes, those 12 miles of water are the exact same as the land. The country's domestic laws apply fully there. If you commit a crime 11 miles off the coast of Florida, you are breaking U.S. law just as if you were standing in downtown Miami.
Okay, but then you go further out.
Right. And you enter the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ. This extends up to 200 nautical miles from the shore.
The money zone.
Exactly. It's not about strict domestic laws like speed limits or anything. It is purely about money and resources. Within that 200-mile ECZ, the coastal nation has the exclusive right to extract natural resources.
Fishing rights, oil drilling.
Yes.
So if there's a massive oil deposit 150 miles off my coast, it is mine. But if it is 201 miles out, it is international waters.
Generally speaking, yes. And this specific framework creates a bizarre high-stakes incentive. Because if you own a tiny rock, there's a tiny island in the middle of nowhere.
You suddenly own a circle of ocean roughly the size of California all around it.
Exactly. Which brings us to the ultimate case study for maritime borders. The Spratly Islands in the South China Sea.
This has to be one of the most complex boundary disputes on the planet right now. You have China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. They are all claiming overlapping parts of this archipelago.
And you have to ask why. Because the islands themselves are minuscule. Some of them are barely just rocks that stick out of the water at high tide.
But they sit right in the middle of critical global trade lanes, and more importantly, huge potential oil reserves.
Right. Under UNCLOS, if you own the rock, you control the sea around it and the resources beneath it. It's highly strategic.
And the tactic here is what really stood out to me in the text. The source notes that China isn't just claiming the existing islands, they are engineering them.
Yes, they are physically building human-made islands.
They are sending out massive dredging ships, pulling up sand and sediment from the ocean floor and dumping it onto existing coral reefs to build actual land where there was only water before.
It is a deliberate attempt to change the physical geography to justify a maritime claim. They build these artificial islands, they put airstrips and military installations on them to establish a presence.
It's basically a loophole in the code of reality.
Yeah.
We went from the river move by accident to we are building brand new land to extend our 200-mile zone.
It really shows that the desire to define what is mine versus what is yours is just a fundamental human drive. And nations will use whatever technology is available, from stacking stones in a field to operating deep-sea dredging ships to enforce those claims.
Which really brings us to the final piece of this whole puzzle, the human element. Because after all the legal treaties, the wars over oil, the island building, what do these boundaries actually do to us as people?
Well, the text describes boundaries not just as barriers, but as filters. They filter everything. And first and foremost, they shape identity. Boundaries define who belongs where. They physically create the concept of us and them.
It is the ultimate team jersey. I am this nationality because I happen to be born inside this specific geometric shape.
In a way, yes, it defines national identity, and then boundaries dictate interaction. They determine how economies trade with each other. They determine who is legally allowed to migrate and who isn't,
They could be open doors or brick walls.
depending entirely on the political relationship. And finally, there's governance. A state cannot function without a boundary. You can't collect taxes if you don't know who you are taxing.
Right, you need a jurisdiction. You can't enforce laws if you don't know where your authority stops. The boundary is what allows the state to exist.
So when we zoom out and look back at all this, we started with the basic 4 phases: define, delimit, demarcate, administer. The birth of a border.
Which gave us the legal structure. And then we looked at the friction, the disputes over legal definitions, the chaos of shifting rivers, disagreements over management, and the wars fought over underground resources.
We saw how lines can be used as weapons, like those colonial superimposed boundaries drawn in Africa that totally ignored the people living there.
And then we ventured out to sea. We saw how UNCLOS tries to divide the ocean into sovereign territory and economic zones, which leads to these massive high-stakes engineering projects in places like the South China Sea. It honestly changes how I look at that map on my wall. Those bold black lines represent so much history, so much intense negotiation, and so much tension.
They do. And if I can leave you and the listener with one final thought to mull over today.
Please, go for it.
We spent a lot of time today talking about how the Rio Grande moved, right? It caused a massive locational dispute purely because nature changed the landscape.
Right.
And then we talked about nations actively building artificial islands in the sea to claim new territory.
Nature moving on its own, and humans building by design.
Exactly. We desperately cling to these definitions of boundaries as fixed, permanent lines. We want the map to be done. But we live in a world where the physical geography itself is constantly changing. Rivers shift course, sea levels are rising, and humans now have the technology to literally create land from the ocean floor.
So the map is never really done.
No, it isn't. And it raises this massive question for the future. In a world where the physical Earth is changing so dramatically, are our rigid 19th century definitions of fixed boundaries becoming totally obsolete? Can a fixed line actually survive in a physically changing world?
Wow. That is a lot to think about. I think I am going to go take another long look at my map, but I definitely won't see it the same way. Thank you so much for helping us unpack all this invisible architecture today.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.